saying, I'm working so hard, I'm doing all the right things, I thought I was paying all the right dues, went through the therapy or whatever it is, and I just can't seem to alleviate F. And once you've been part of an abuse cycle where there is no compassionate witness, there is no protector, you often will fail to figure out how to protect yourself. If you don't feel comfortable telling your friends, your family, and your colleagues the condition of your relationship, if there is shame.
Welcome back to the Happy on the Inside podcast. Today's episode is for every soul who has ever felt trapped by their past and is ready to break free. My guest is Dr. Bridget Cooper, a cage-rattling change agent, best-selling author, and a trauma disruptor who has made it her mission to help people rewrite their stories and reclaim their power. She's not just an expert, she has lived it. From a childhood marked by chaos and abuse to a life of fierce healing and bold authenticity, Dr. B shows us what's possible when you stop playing small and start healing loud. Dr. Bridget Cooper, what a thrill to have you back on my podcast. So great to see you again.
It's so good to see you, Anna. I can't believe that it's been as long as it's been that we've been in this forum. I mean, I know we've spoken in all sorts of other spaces, but this one's very special to me. I'm so glad to be back.
I know. I've noticed there are some changes in your life that happened most recently. Like you became a hypnotherapist. Congratulations! Yeah. But
thank you.
For our listeners, would you tell us in 3 words, if you summarize, what is it that you do?
3 words. Solve problems differently.
Oh, what does it mean?
And I don't even know, maybe it's see problems differently, because I think solving problems differently, that says that I see the same problems other people see, and I don't know that I do. So I think it might be see problems differently. I think a lot of times people are working really, really hard to alleviate the pain and create more success in their lives and their work. And oftentimes when they come to me, they're tired. They're tired of kind of banging their head up against that same wall, saying, I'm working so hard, I'm doing all the right things, I thought I was paying all the right dues, I went through the therapy or whatever it is, and I just can't seem to alleviate X or Y or XYZ and more letters. And what I tend to do is see the problem that they're solving differently than the problem they think they're supposed to be solving, so we can create new and novel approaches to solve that underlying problem that will alleviate all of the other kind of surface problems that they've been directing their attention at.
That's the very reason I actually started working with counselors on my trauma, with hypnotherapists, psychologists, because I could not see what is my actual problem. I've created all these ideas, all these stories about myself, trying to figure out how to get out of the situation for years, and then getting a totally different perspective. Because you know how they say, when we are the picture, we can't see what's behind the frame.
Right.
It actually speed up my healing process.
Yeah.
Extremely, extremely fast. Dr. B, have you ever had this feeling when you have a clients and when they share their struggles and their challenges with you? You're like, yep, I can resonate with that. Yep, went through this. Yep, know exactly how it feels.
Have you ever? Yeah, so many times. And I think I was actually just speaking with someone about this actually this morning, and they are working in the healing arts, and they were talking about, yeah, but I'm struggling with this. How can I give them advice on that? And I said, yeah, but like if you're a tennis coach, your tennis game is not perfect. You're simply coaching the parts of either your game or your understanding of the game that are further elevated than theirs is. So you may not be able to coach someone who is way beyond your capacity, but as long as they are in either a different part of their journey or they're a few steps behind where you just completed, you can be so helpful. So I think that's really the case of, I know so many clients of mine have come to me at when I have completed, and I say that in air quotes, completed a certain part of my healing journey. I've gotten to some certain rung on that ladder. And then they come to me, I'm like, oh yes, just there. I remember like it could have been almost yesterday where I had that epiphany and this is what changed things for me. Let's see if it could be useful for you. And in that way, there's this like sense of a collective in these spaces that we find ourselves of teaming together and helping people along that journey. That there might be a person in the healing process who's helping heal others, and maybe they are 10 years away from something that you've found, but the people who are proximate to them may be 15 years behind, and so they can help them. So like we're all kind of doing our part in the places that we find ourselves so that we can help the people who are resonating with our message, and we are finding a way to assist.
It's like in a movie, Catch Me If You Can. The
Yeah.
main actor, Frank Abagnale, they taught the whole semester in a school without any education. And they asked him later on, how did you do this? He was like, I was just reading a student's book and I was one lesson ahead. So you need to be
Right.
one lesson ahead. But Dr. B, based on my own experience, when I was going through my healing journey, I was looking for people who can resonate with me, who can understand
Mm-hmm.
me, who
Mm-hmm.
knows how I felt back then. And what I love about you, you went through this. And for people who haven't heard your story,
Mm-hmm.
would you please tell us how it started? Why have you decided to help people?
I think so. I'll answer the second question before I answer the
Mhm.
first. The second question is, why did I use it to help people? I remember sitting in my therapist's office when I was 18 or 19 years old, and I had come unglued. I was unraveling. I had been very close to attempting suicide for what I think would have been the final time. I think I would have been successful that time because I think I meant it even more because I was so desperate in the depth of my pain. And I remember sitting with my therapist and saying to her, if I can just figure out how to get through and beyond this, I can help other people do the same. And I can be grateful that this happened because it'll give me the opportunity to teach other people how to get through their own struggle. And she was just like, no, that's not what we're going to do. We're not going to be thankful right now for what's happened to you. And I understood her message, which was don't do what other people in your life who are close to you and are supposed to protect you did, which was try to make something good out of something horrible instead of them taking accountability and working to protect you. I definitely understood her hesitation,
Mhm.
to put it mildly on my approach, but I was so clear that I was going to make something good out of it because for a few reasons, but I think primarily because I didn't want to have wasted the pain. That seemed like such a sin, and not from a religious standpoint, but just from a not being present with the opportunity that it provided to me. And in terms of my story, I'll say the line that I dropped in my TED talk that actually had me freeze and leave stage after someone gasped when I said it. But I said that the first time that my father beat me, and it was to the point, as my mother described it, beat me bloody, like, broke skin. I was 8 weeks old. So the domestic violence and the sexual violence that I witnessed and experienced started prior to really any cognitive memory of those things. And as you can imagine and relate to, that once you've become an object instead of a person, and once you've been part of an abuse cycle where there is no compassionate witness, there is no protector, you often will fail to figure out how to protect yourself. And you'll find yourself reliving and reincarnating and re-experiencing those same hurts over and over and over again. You know, some of my friends ask me, how come those horrible things happen to you so many times and they never happened to me? And I said, because I was ripe for the picking, because I had had no real sense of my own safety, my own security. I didn't understand where I was supposed to show up in relationship with adults and peers and all sorts of things. So I was always kind of a beacon for anyone who wanted to take advantage or, you know, be in an abuser role. So I think that that's kind of without going into all, as you know, I mean, we all have stories that we could write books about, which I did. But there's so many stories to that, but that kind of encapsulates, I think, for me, the journey through and hopefully out, that kind of shows you how I got out of that.
You were beaten by your father at 8 weeks old for the very first time. He was on drugs when he
Yes,
unleashed his rage on you.
correct.
And
Correct.
I
Yep.
know you wouldn't obviously remember those moments. It's your mom told you when you were older.
Yeah, not even that old. I was in elementary school when she would share those stories. She would share a lot of stories with me about the abuse that she suffered, about the abuse that I suffered. And I think the most complex part of that is that I would have a very different kind of perspective on my mom and her journey. And I think our relationship would have been very different if in that moment it had stopped with never again, right? Kind of like that Colleen Hoover book and then movie, It Ends With Us. This idea of never again will that happen. And instead, she carried on a lifelong love for my father and was always hoping to get him back. And that, in and of itself, had so many tendrils in my psyche for what my worth was in that setting, not my true worth, but in that kind of frame, my safety, any kind of regard, because I cannot imagine having someone that I cared about treat someone I loved and a child no less, and then want to continue to be in relationship with them even after I got out and away from that, So I think it was a very complex family dynamic.
Now, as a therapist, and now based on all your experience looking back,
Mm-hmm.
how would you explain your behavior?
I have looked at her behavior and it wasn't episodic. It was very much part of who she was and continued to be up until the time that she died. I think there was a lot that was going on in her psyche. I think, for one, she had untreated mental illness. She had been diagnosed as bipolar, and I think that was part of it. I think there was a lot, and this is part. You and I have had some of these conversations on and off air about this idea that we tell these stories. You were talking about, telling these stories about your own existence, your own path, your own problems, and those stories take on a life of their own. And I think, as part of the abuse cycle, as well as her definition of love, as broken as it was, she really thought that that was love and he was just having some bad moments that could be looked past. And that reincarnated and recreated itself when I left my own abusive husband. I can see it as this very stuck place in her consciousness that somehow seeing someone's darkness and accepting someone's darkness could be synonymous. And to me, seeing someone's darkness and accepting it in terms of accepting it into my world are very different things. You know, I can appreciate it and I can regard it and I can have compassion for it, but to have it have proximity to me, my mom, I don't think had any capacity to be able to see those differentiations.
Did you feel any love from her?
Oh, I felt so much love from her. I think that's the most confusing thing oftentimes when our parents are our caretakers, our family members, et cetera, are the ones who have hurt us in those grave, really debilitating ways, is that she had an almost obsessive love with me. Like she was so easily fractured by my rejection of her, my anger at her. There was so much. It was driven by need. Like I know you've read a lot about attachment theory, and she had very unhealthy attachment as it related to me, and she almost saw me as this like path to redemption or something, that somehow if I accepted her, everything that she had done would be okay, which is one of the reasons why one of my longer struggles and what I did my TED talk on was on forgiveness, because it was so heavy for her that if I forgave her, that somehow she was redeemed instead of her being able to give any of those gifts to herself and right herself in her own mind. So yeah, I think she loved and regarded me. I just think she clearly didn't know how to protect me. And she didn't know how to really embrace me as a person aside from her daughter. I think there was like a real drive for enmeshment, for like just a fusion in that space. And probably because we were trauma bonded. I don't, we could get into all sorts of um, psychoanalysis of the reasons, but that's kind of been my sense of her.
The reason I ask this question is because when I look back, when I see the whole picture, what was happening, I was trying to understand what was behind my mom's thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
my mom's understanding, what was behind my stepfather's
Right.
thoughts, like what were they thinking about, why they couldn't see that this relationship are totally unhealthy. And I
Right.
realized that it was a conditioning coming
Mm,
from their childhood. They didn't know anything better. And you're right.
right.
I think my mom thought physical and mental and emotional abuse was some kind of love showing, love signs.
Yeah. And a lot of people see, like, it's funny because people who initially hear my story, they focus on my dad as being the one who was, evil or whatever moniker they put on him. And those who know the story more and have seen things through the years and observed my mom, people who are closer to me, have so much more animosity toward my mom than they do my dad. And I find that both compelling and interesting. I think one, from kind of a patriarchal society where mom is supposed to do more and have lower expectations, which robs both parents of kind of a fair space. But I also think it's because my dad's was episodic and he tried so many times to leave. And as harmful as the leaving was, there was a recognition in himself that he was not up to the task. Whereas my mom did not do that. And I think inflicted a lot of damage in that right. And I think you and I have some parallel stories around that sense of, it was, I think, so scary for my mom to really embrace what she had allowed to happen for her own selfish endeavors, that it created kind of like a break in her mind. Like if she'd really faced that, where she would have gone with that. Like that was a really hard place for her to exist in.
My stepfather tried to leave a few times as well, and my mom did everything to bring him back. It was kind of codependent relationship. She was so afraid to lose him. And within the time I've understood her, it was very shameful to be a single mother of two back then in Russia. And so
Right.
she did everything, and she put him on pedestal and allowed to do everything just for him to stay,
Right.
which is the biggest mistake. And I think not many people talk about actually about this topic,
Mm,
how to recognize that you are in abusive relationship, how to
right.
recognize that your life and the life of your kids in danger
Right.
actually.
I think one of the ways, and I've talked with some of my clients who have been in and gotten out of, I have one transitioning out of one right now, is that if you don't feel comfortable telling your friends, your family, and your colleagues the condition of your relationship, if there is shame, if there is fear, if there is a retelling that when you like you're thinking about the relationship and you're like, oh, this I better say it this way, something's wrong. Like that is like the first alert that something's wrong in the relationship. You know, when you can live authentically, when you can share the stories authentically. And of course, you're not going to share all of the most intimate details, but when you're shading things, when you're leaving details out, when you're intentionally trying to make something sound better than it is, that should be like a siren coming to the forefront that there might be something really wrong in your relationship.
I love this.
Mm.
That yeah, that's really actually I haven't thought about this. But Dr. B, I want to go back to your story. When the second abuse happened, because first happened when you were 8 weeks old.
Yeah, it continued until my mom left him when I was about 2.5. So that continued until I was about 2.5, maybe 3. And then she sent me to visit him alone. Like I was alone. I was sent on a plane alone to see him in Northern California where he was living with his common law wife. Um, and it continued there. And then after that, I wasn't allowed to visit with him alone anymore. And my mom moved from California to the East Coast about a year later. And so the proximity, the physical abuse stopped. Like I didn't have another time where he had any physical access to me. I only saw him a handful of times after that. What and this is actually what I've kind of recounted to people in talking about my relationship with my father, that as devastating a blow as and as formative a blow as those things, like what I'm how my mind must have been trying to make sense and relate and feel safe or not feel safe, you know, to the world in that space, that was tragic and awful. I think for what because it's much more in my conscious memory and it was much more in the way I related to myself and to other people, was his comings and goings throughout the next subsequent, you know, 10 or 15 years, and the drawings that he would send me of me and, you know, lingerie and like the sexualizing of me as a teen, and the way that I could be so easily disregarded and disposed of, really, right? Just like he would come and he would call every day and be, you know, telling me how much he loved me. And I would think, oh my gosh, my daddy's going to change. He's going to stay in my life. And he'd say, I'll call you tomorrow. And I wouldn't find him again for a year and a half. And I think that like successive abandonment with the being like objectified and feeling like I had to be better to make him stay, those were the patterns that I think were so hard to like rip out at the root as a burgeoning young woman, getting into romantic relationship and then creating all of those fractures and bruises and cuts that then had, you know, like they just kind of built on one another. And I think those were also so hurtful, you know?
And confusing as well. Very
Yeah.
confusing, especially as a young lady. when we start developing what kind of relationship do I have with my father, and who am I actually for him?
Right. Right. Oh, absolutely. And I think I related to him as I, I had to be useful. I had to be helpful. I had to be understanding no matter what he did, or he'd go away again. Like I was responsible for his actions and abandonment. And because my mom was so unhealthy, there was nothing she was doing even at that time to stand in the way of that, to like somehow figure that out. And so I think there was just so much coming at me that I just ended up in a tough mental space of just sorting through things that I couldn't really understand where they were coming from.
Would you mind sharing a little bit more how this childhood trauma affected your adulthood?
I think there were what I call tendrils that kind of like reached out from childhood into adulthood. I think one, the sexual trauma created a very reduced dimension of my sexuality, which was I was there to serve and my pleasure could be weaponized. So it was kind of like this very unhealthy way of, instead of being just pure and open and real in that space, it was so much more performative and for acceptance. So I think that was like from the sexual abuse side and the objectification, I think that was something that really kept having to be pulled out, kept having to be pruned back, over the years. And I think the second one that is just competes for precedent is the idea that love meant suffering. That somehow that the more that I endured for the person that I loved, that was what made me the acceptable and wanted partner. So if I held a boundary, then I was mean and, I could be left and that sort of thing. Like that piece, it would pop up. I could turn the volume down on it a bit, but it would just like, I would find it again and again going, oh yeah, there it is. Yep, there it is. It's still wanting to kind of find its place in that. And even as I grew in my own acceptance of who I was in relationship and romantic relationship, that same invitation to show up in that way kept presenting itself.
When was the moment when you maybe realized enough is enough? I want to change something.
I think I've had so many inflection points, Anna. I think one of them was the night when I was in college. I was a sophomore in college, and I was, like I said, I was unraveling, and I was so clear that I was within moments of going to the roof or figuring out some way of ending my life. And I remember thinking it's me or him.
Mm.
And I was talking about my dad. And I was the narrative of it was, if I continue to allow him to come in and go out of my life and dominate my consciousness and my worry and my self-reflection in the way that I have allowed him to hold that power all this time. And I wasn't this articulate when I was thinking about it, but it was this essence that I was going to submerge. I was going to suffocate under the weight of that. And so I fractured that relationship. I completely removed him out of my life. So when he died 5.5 years later, I had never spoken to him again. And I think that pivot was a huge pivot and like leaped me forward in a lot of ways. It sucked me in, but I think it allowed me to leap forward. And then I've just had so many like, since then of this, whether it was with my ex-husband or, in certain friendship relationships or with my mom, I think there were these just little awakenings, these little places where I said, yeah, no, this is not for me. Like this feels too familiar and not good familiar. And I think that those have happened many, many times. Like I wish I could, write it like a movie script and say it was one day and then everything changed. Then I was all better and then happily ever after. I haven't had that experience. I keep using my life as a workshop. And so I keep finding myself in the lab. And I think it's just, I spill the beaker a lot less and I, don't get the burns, nearly as much. And, the smells are a little bit more palatable, but I do find myself in those spaces again and again where I continue to go back to the wound and make sure that it's healed, or go back to the scar and make sure that it's like covered over and that sort of thing, just to really learn more and more about myself and about humanity, so I can, in my experience, help other people with their own, kind of reconciliation with life.
Dr. B, and let me know if you don't want to answer this question. So many girls after such an abuse are going into drugs, alcohol, you name it. Did you have any trouble with escapism behavior?
That's a great question. I think no, I didn't. I've never done any. I've had some pot over the years. Most of it was from my mom when I was a smaller child, because there was that. But I think I knew there were a few things I think going on and why I didn't go into that space. I think my role in my family, with my parents especially, was that of savior, was that of rescuer. And I think that if I had done something self-injurious, other than just die, which I tried several times, but if I were to have become the project, then I would have let them down. And so I think there was something self-preserving in having that role, for which I'm really grateful, that I was both a rescuer and rebel. And I think having those kind of two almost opposing but also complementary relationships and roles is that I was rescuing the people, trying to save them, and then saying F that when it wasn't working and getting myself out. And because of that, and because of how much I hated some of the things that my family members were doing to hurt themselves, that I had to keep trying to figure out how to fix or rescue or escape or whatever, I defined myself in opposition to their choices, which meant that whatever they were doing, I was going to do something differently. So the idea of doing drugs, the idea of going to jail, the idea, like it became absolutely not. I'm going to be something different than they are. So in a lot of ways, our roles allow us or invite us to be sucked in or jettisoned out. And for me, it was jettisoned out in a lot of ways, luckily.
Kind of blessing in disguise. Dr. B, I am so grateful that you had the courage and shared your story, because I was the one who benefited at the very beginning. And I shared this story at the very beginning of my healing journey. I just went on YouTube and I Googled childhood sexual abuse, and your TED Talks pop up the very first.
Yeah.
And I have a question about this.
Thanks.
Where did you get the courage to actually start sharing your story?
Okay. This is going to be a fun part of our talk. So one of the things, there were contributing factors to this idea of courage. One of them is that I've been telling my story to friends since college, and started sharing kind of what was happening. And I was pushed to tell my story by other people, to say, like, you got to give people hope, and I wanted to do that, right? I wanted to use my story for other people's use. And I think all three of my parents dying allowed me to not have to worry about navigating those relationships within that story, right? Like my aunt was still alive, and she read it and thought I treated my parents very fairly, given their wild imperfections. Yet there would have been that complexity that would have presented itself if I'd done it before they were, gone. But I want to push back on this idea of courage because I get into this with people, it is one of those ways that I look at a problem differently. And I think recently we've had a very beautiful example of this hit the stage, the consciousness in France. And I'm going to forget her name, but there was a woman whose husband was drugging her, and he was drugging her at night. She thought she had some sort of sleep disorder or something because she was always waking very tired, but he was drugging her tea. And what he was doing was he was putting her an ad on their equivalent of some, social post area. And he had over 100 men come in and violate her on film while she was basically comatose. And in the trial of all these men and her husband, she demanded that her name be public and that it be televised. And her rationale was the same as mine when I'm asked, or said, oh, you have so much courage telling your story. I've said what she said, which was, the shame is not mine. This is not my shame. And what happens when we articulate telling a story of how we were violated or injured by someone else is we buy into this old norm of it being our shame, of having to rise out of a shame that isn't ours. Now, if my father had written this story, yeah, that's some courage. My mom had written this story, yeah, that's some courage. But in the same way that if my house was burglared or my car was stolen and I reported it to the police and I told my story on the news, not one person would say how courageous I was. But somehow if my sexuality or my body is violated or injured, it becomes a courageous moment. I want to flip that script because it is fair in the context we live in. So I appreciate the comment, like truly I do, because I know where you're coming from. But I also want to rail against the idea that that is what courage looks like.
And I love this conversation because when you shared this perspective with me for the very first time, like 3 years ago, I thought, really, like it. Why, if someone hurt you, why should I be courageous and tell the story? But there are so many people are still struggling in silence because for different reasons, but most main reason is fear of judgment.
Right.
Have you had any bad feedbacks or comments?
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. Right. I mean, I think where it comes from, I think the fear of judgment is one part of it. I think also that when, especially you've been the repeated victim of abuse or even a one-time exchange, there's either you're being told that it is your fault or you come to believe that it is your fault. And it's a self-preservation mechanism because if you believe it's your fault, then you believe there's something you could do to change it. So in some ways, it's the biggest gift you give to yourself in that moment to be able to survive that moment or series of moments, to somehow take on more responsibility than is rightfully yours. But if you stay there, that's when I think the damage occurs. For me, I remember my ex-husband in court said, I never called her anything she didn't deserve.
Interesting.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a take. And I think there is I have not heard it said to me except by people who were either held accountable in some part of my story or it wasn't said to me. So I think the people who have come to me in a very different way. There's actually one person who's in the story who apologized to me for their part in the path. So I think there is that opportunity for healing oftentimes that we don't appreciate, you know. And I know my aunt, for one, when she read the story, one of the things that she reached out and said to me was, "I'm so sorry, I should have stepped in." And I agreed with her. She's right. That would have been a very helpful thing for her to have done. But she didn't, and I forgive her. Yet I think telling our stories sometimes allows us to see the part that we have played, perhaps in our own silence and standing for someone who needed to be stood for, or being complicit in a situation where we needed to use our voices. And so I think we do other people a great service by taking that risk, because the judgment really is going to come from people who are already judging themselves or who are not taking accountability. Everyone else is simply going to want to hear the story to find its message and its blessing.
I love to say, turn your trauma into your superpower. When I
Mm-hmm.
went publicly for the very first time in my hometown, oh my goodness, I copped so much heat. And some comments were really, really silly. And it really affected me. It really
Yeah.
affected me. Even though it was like 5% of all of the comments, they
Right.
still, and I really regret that I shared my story publicly. I was like, stuff this, like I'm giving you my soul and giving you my voice and opening up, and you just poke back at
Yeah.
me. But then I realized even Jesus Christ was crucified.
Right.
And sometime later, when I did a bit more work on myself, I actually went back to this article and to those comments, and I got all those negative comments, and I started using them for my book to address those judgments, because I realized people just don't understand. They look at this situation like physical, emotional, and sexual abuse through their own perspective, through their own lenses. So it's nothing. It was nothing to do with me. It was them flicking their pain and anger on me.
Oh, absolutely. Because if I see myself in your story and I am not willing to acknowledge seeing myself in your story, I am going to attack your story. That's just how people work. So I think it's helpful to see defensiveness and attack as a protective mechanism for people who are being confronted with something that makes them uncomfortable. Because if they really just simply had a problem with your story and they thought you were making so much of it or you're lying or whatever, they would reach out to you individually and be like, tell me more, because I'm really struggling with what you're saying. Versus, I mean, again, having like internet muscles and doing whatever, they do out there. That's something very, very different. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry you went through that, because it's hard enough to be able to go against that fabric of don't say anything and then say it, feel some sort of strength about that, and then have that tamped on. That's hard.
Thank you, Dr. B. And I also received hundreds of positive letters where people were
Of course.
opening up to me. And you know what I realized? If every woman and a man would open up about their sexual abuses, we would be the majority.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's very sad, but one out of 5 girls in some statistics, some cases are underreported, and 1 in 8 boys are getting sexually abused.
Yeah.
The statistics are like scary. And again, not many people would come up and talk about this. So I think we would be majority. And that's why I want this podcast to go out because I want
Mm,
people to know that there is nothing to be afraid of sharing this story. In fact, it's very freeing.
right. Yeah. And I think, for me, I think the one hesitation, because I do more personal work, but I also do a lot of corporate work. I do a lot of industry work. And so I had been kind of riding that fence between the two worlds when I came out with not only the TED Talk, but prior to it, Little Landslides, which is my story. And one of the kind of litmus tests that I did was when I wrote it, I sent it to one of my major, very conservative clients. And I said, I have one question for you that I need you to answer after you read it, which is, would you still hire me if you read this before you met me? And their response was, after they read it, was, I'd hire you faster.
Wow.
Because I think what happens is when you recognize, especially in the work that I do, because I do a lot of like high pressure, high conflict, kind of really dramatic, upheavals in corporate leadership and organizational leadership, they want to know that I've got the chops for it. And when you know where I've come from, you recognize nothing scares me. There's nothing I can't figure out. There's nothing I can't deal with. Like you don't, whatever you think is going to overwhelm or intimidate me, step aside, right? Like you know what I mean? We're tough cookies. And I think that was my only fear was stepping out in that way and having people who, because it's my livelihood. It's not because it's a popularity contest, but I want to make sure I'm still making money and I'm supporting my children and I'm paying my bills, that I didn't harm my career substantially in a way that I couldn't recover in other ways quickly. And it didn't happen. My career got better, my income got better. So that's a testament to the voice being used.
In a very powerful way. Mhm.
Mm.
Dr. B, I want to go back a little bit to your story. I know your parents passed away. How did you have this closure with them?
Mm. Oh, so with my father, it was not available in life. So he died before I was able to find him again. I had let him go. I had cast him out of my life. And then I kept being nagged like he was going to die and I wasn't going to be able to change that last interaction to be anything cleaner or softer or clearer than it was. And I found out he died a month after he died. So I never got that closure in life. What I did do was I wrote a letter to myself from him. And part of that relies on my spiritual leanings, which is that when we're here, we get encumbered by and overwhelmed by so many shackles and pains of this human existence. And when we leave this, those things are like busted off of us, right? And it's then that we're able to see things in a more clear space and come from love and not from pain. And my dad was just so riddled with so much pain that he created pain. He brought pain. He brought joy too. He was a complex guy. And so I was able to, in his death, think of him more in that space than I was in the other. And the other thing that it did for me is it made me very clear about not leaving things with people in a way that I didn't want to be the last moment. So he taught me our relationship, that fracture taught me that great lesson that I was very intent on making sure I left relationships the way that I could leave them permanently. And so, like with my stepfather, when he was, I knew dying, but my mom was telling me he was going to be fine. I went to see him, and I said my piece, and we had our moment. And the same thing happened with my mom. shortly before she died, I made my peace with her. I said the things I needed to say to her, and I had continued to do that throughout our relationship. And I was so grateful that when I got the news of her, being basically, brain dead, that there was no hope for survival, that I hadn't left it undone, that I hadn't left it as this open, gaping wound like my dad had been for me. And not because I took the response, I did at the time because I was still broken and wounded, but I didn't take I didn't take the invitation to just be consumed by guilt for how I left it. I kept fighting against that. And in doing that, I was able to make different choices with my remaining parents. And I think that was really quite helpful, so that I wasn't left kind of trying to work out with a ghost anything. And again, not because my mom did anything differently and we had this beautiful relationship at the end, but because I spoke my truth in a way that was gentle and kind and from love, not from anger and desperation and protection. And that's a very different kind of departure.
Did you feel like it freed you up in some way?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think, when I look at how my half sister and we have same mom, different fathers, how she and I processed my mom's death, it was so different. And it was because I had a little bit more practice, than she did in some of these areas. But I think mostly because I had left my mom and I was clear. Like I knew where I was. I knew where she was. I wasn't trying to get from death something that I didn't get from life. Like I had grieved her limitations. I had grieved my limitations. I had grieved our story. And because my sister had not done that, it was a very protracted process for her that I think she's probably still going through 10, 11 years later, because it's much harder to do, I think, in death, you know.
Dr. B, you wrote so many books. I will post links to your books here below, on YouTube. And what book would you recommend for someone who would like to learn more about you?
So I think if you want to learn more about me as a problem solver, I think probably either the last book that I published, or by the time this comes out, the most recent book that I've published. So either the book or Unflappable, I think those are my toolkits on how I see time, how I see problems, that sort of thing. If you're looking more for the recovery process of getting through trauma, of understanding how to grieve the things that weren't given to us, of how to stand as your own compassionate witness 5, 10, 30, 50, 60 years later, that would definitely be Little Landslides. That is my story. It's a tough read, but I think that there's a companion kind of in the back of the book. I say back of the book, it's like the last third of the book. It's my tools on how I figured out how to rise up and recover through that trauma. So I think that's really helpful. Those would be what I would recommend. I've done 8. So only picking 3, I guess, is a good thing.
Dr. B, where people can find you?
Well, I'm on all the social media things except I'm not on X, but you can find me on Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram. I think the easiest way to find me and all of those connections is through my website at drbridgetcooper.com, and the doctor is abbreviated, so it's drbridgetcooper.com. I know you're going to put the links in your show notes. And yeah, you can link to my books there. You can reach out to me. I give, free 15-minute consultations if you have any interest in working with me as a client, or recommending me to someone else to come and speak to a group or work with you one-on-one. I would love to be able to continue to spread messages of healing, of novel problem solving, and just do what we can to uplift the world. So thanks for having me on again, Anna, and thank you for all the work that you're doing in this same space to help people heal so that we can stop hurting one another.
Oh, Dr. B, it's thank you for being here. And just before we go, do you have any concluding thoughts?
Mm. I hope that we can begin each day not only in gratitude, but in curiosity as to what we can do to make our life and the lives of those around us better. I hope this for the world. I think we are in grave and dire need of healing. And I think if we all shone that kind of light together of looking for ways to be grateful and to be helpful, I think we could all be so much better.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Bridget Cooper.
Thank you, Anna.